In today's video, I'll be taking this armless and eyeless Dalek toy and returning it to a completed state with the help of these replacement replica parts. Join me as my 30-year journey to recapture this long-lost childhood toy of mine finally comes to its natural conclusion. Hello and many thanks for joining me again today. I always appreciate that, so thanks for your continued support, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. Please feel free to have a look around at all my other videos, and if you like what you see, why not consider subscribing, as that always helps the channel out immeasurably. Now, today's project isn't going to be a big involved build by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, it's going to be a rather small scale affair, because what I am going to be doing, if you didn't already know by my opening comments or looking at the thumbnail or even reading the title, is to finally finish something that I started some time ago. If you're a long-time viewer, you'll know that back in January of 2018, I bought a vintage Palitoy Dalek with the aim of restoring it so that I could recapture part of my childhood, as I always associate this particular toy with my dear, late father. However, when it arrived, it was in a far better shape than I had originally anticipated, as cosmetically, it was in a near-perfect condition. All that was wrong with it was that it no longer spoke, and it was missing all the appendages. Well, with a bit of jiggery-pokery and some judicious cleaning, I quickly got it talking again. So let's go for it and see what he does. I think that's a success, really. And there work ended as I became sidetracked with other concerns, mainly family life and paid commissions. So the poor old thing ended up sitting on a shelf for many months, armless and eyeless, in my display cabinet, just waiting for me to get back to him. Talk about an undignified situation, that really is no way for any self-respecting Dalek war machine to end up like, so let's crack on and rectify it. The first thing that I decided not to do was to try and reinvent the wheel, so I went straight to eBay and purchased a set of replica parts from a seller calling themselves Acme 3000. Looking at these pieces, they're clearly duplicated from an original set, and are seemingly pressure cast in black polyurethane resin. As a result, the quality is really very nice indeed, with no air bubbles present or any other distracting blemishes that need to be filled or sanded back. They also require almost no cleanup at all, save for a tiny amount of flash removal along the obvious seam lines. But then these were evident on the originals, as I well remember. To begin with, they needed a damn good wash in some warm, soapy water, so using my wife's toothbrush, obviously not mine of course, I'm not that stupid, I scrubbed out and removed any and all traces of the release agent that may have been left over from the casting process. There was also a considerable amount of dust that had accumulated within the detail crevices, particularly around the gun and the eye stalk, so this too needed to be removed and cleaned during this pass. Having done that, once it was rinsed off in clean water and subsequently dried, the next task was to use a fine wire wool to gently key the surfaces to give the paint that I'll be using later something to grab onto. Now that the parts were all nice and clean, I took my flush cut snips and carefully removed the appendages from the sprue tree so that I could work on each piece individually. To smooth out the seam lines, I used a soft nail file, paying particular attention to the outer lip of the plunger piece, as this is going to be quite the focal point and I didn't want any unruly lines spoiling the look of the toy. After a quick test fitting, I could see that the parts were a little on the loose side, but not by much. However, I knew that once a few layers of paint was applied, this would no longer be an issue and the fit would be secure enough for display purposes. To make handling these rather small parts easier for me during the painting process, I took some wooden barbecue skewers and hot glued the ends of the appendages to them. This meant that I could freely position them in any direction to ensure that I got a full coverage without missing any spots. And now we get to the fun part, well, for me at any rate, adding the colour. Painting is pretty much a standard affair, and in this case, I began with a foundation pass of primer from Halfords, a car maintenance, camping and touring supplies company based here in the UK. After a couple of layers and when I was happy with the finished result, I moved on to the all-important top coat. This time around, I'm having a little unplanned departure from my usual brand of Halfords spray paints, as I'm trying out this satin black aerosol from Rust-Oleum's Painter's Touch range, mainly because when I asked my wife to pick up some satin black while she was out doing her Christmas shopping, this was what she came back with. I've never used it before, so it'll be interesting to me to see how it compares. As usual, I started with a light tack coat across all the parts, then came back a few minutes later to apply the next few passes. I have to admit to you though, I was somewhat cautious given the fact that by now we were fully entrenched in winter, but the coverage seemed to take well despite the cold temperature, and it gave a rather pleasing result. Frankly though, with a project this small, I couldn't really see any obvious discernible difference between the quality of the Halfords brand and the Rust-Oleum, so in fairness, a larger project is needed to really run it through its paces. The final colour application for this project is the red coat for the IM plunger. Now normally I'd lay down a white base to make the colour pop, but on the originals the red was clearly laid directly over the bare black plastic, making it slightly darker in tone, and so I opted to follow the original's lead, just for the sake of authenticity. For an application of this tiny size, I could easily have just brush painted the elements by hand and had done with it, but instead I chose to use an airbrush because I really didn't want any obvious streaks on something so small, and the airbrush would prevent that from happening. Also, the gloss red that I selected for the job just happened to be left over from a previous project, and is more suited to being thinned down and sprayed rather than hand painted, so it was sort of a no-brainer to opt for this method anyway. The first thing to do was to mask off the eye stalk and the plunger arm, leaving the ends free to receive the chosen paint, while the plunger itself would be handled separately and wouldn't require any masking of any kind, which kind of makes things easier for me, as that's always a good thing in my view. So, with the paint thinned and the compressor set to around 20 psi, I took my time and slowly built up the colour density in multiple thin passes, until I found myself at a point where I felt happy enough that it reflected the original tone as seen on the toys back in the day. And that more or less brought me to the end of the project, so all I had to do now was put it all together and admire the finished handiwork. I do have to say that while this was an incredibly simple project, and I guess this is the video equivalent, for you at any rate, of watching paint dry, for me it's been an entirely different story. It's the culmination of 30 years of desire and dreaming to get something back that I once owned. Something that I entirely associate with my dad, as he was the one that bought me and my brother multiples of these during the early 1980s. It was also he who mistakenly threw them all away thinking they were broken, when in fact I'd only dismantled them for cleaning. If he'd just left them alone, we wouldn't be here now. So it does warm my heart to have this back in my collection, and while it isn't one of my originals, it still stands as a lovely little reminder of someone who I've lost, who was and still is very dear to me. Speaking of my dad, since the last video on this subject, it's come to light via a conversation with my dear old mum why he ended up buying us so many of these toys over such a short period of time in the first place. Well, it was purely down to the simple matter that he'd bought a brand new television set, and on the first Saturday of every month he'd take me and my brother up to the shop and ride on the Isle of Wight where we used to live, and paid it off in cash instalments. And while he was dealing with that, he said that we could go off and pick any toy for ourselves, and for some reason we always ended up choosing the Daleks. So, there's that little mystery solved then. In closing, if you happen to have a Palitoy Dalek as well of your own that's missing some appendages, then I'd strongly suggest that you purchase yourself a set of these duplicates if you're wanting to restore yours to its former glory. In fact, I'd highly recommend these to anyone really, and no, I have absolutely no affiliation whatsoever with Acme 3000, just in case you were wondering. My final thoughts? Well, as you already know, I'm immeasurably glad to have this back on my shelf, and it genuinely does give me a lot of joy as a result. However, there is one added bonus here. Given the slightly inaccurate and naive design of this toy, it really does make it an ideal buddy for this 6-inch tall Playmobil 4th Doctor dolly, as the pair complement each other so well that you'd think it was almost done deliberately. Well, that's me done for now. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you so much as always for joining me, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and even share this video if you like, as it all helps. So, until next time, stay well, stay happy, and we'll chat again soon.